think we are. Okay, so thanks everyone who has joined us. I imagine we'll have a few more people joining us in the next few minutes, but we should get going because everyone's got things to do. But I appreciate the fact that Carrie Bentley, who heads Gridwell Consulting, but Gridwell Consulting takes care of our CAISO committee duties. And Carrie and Callie have been doing analysis on the blackouts that occurred in mid-August, virtually from the moment they happened, and started doing in-depth analysis the days afterwards. This is a more expanded and updated view of and review of an analysis of the data with regard to what happened, why it happened. And it's been updated not only to take into consideration additional data, but also to have a review of the root cause analysis that was done by the CPUC, the CEC, and CAISO that everyone was the subject of an California Assembly meeting. So without further ado, let me, well, a couple of housekeeping tips before I introduce Carrie to go through the presentation. The way that we'll handle questions is we'll take clarifying questions while she's going through the presentation. And there are two ways that people can ask clarifying questions. Frank McDonald and I will be monitoring the chat line. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, everybody should be familiar with this. There's a chat function that people can type in comments to everybody or questions directly to me or to the group. And we'll pick them up, and if there's something that needs clarifying, we'll do that. The other way that people can do that is there's a raise your hand function that is if you open the participants box there, there's a raise the hand function. Both Frank and I will be monitoring that, and this function is particularly useful if people actually want to go on camera and ask the question themselves. So either the chat function or opening the participants box and raising your hand, and we'll recognize those for clarifying questions. At the end of the presentation, which we hope will be about an hour, we'll open it up for dialogue amongst the participants. And again, that can either be done by chat, and I can bring them up for a discussion with Carrie or with others, or people can raise their hand and actually go on camera and engage in the discussion themselves. So with that, let me turn this over to Carrie. Carrie, the floor is yours, and you're controlling the presentation.
All right, Yep. Okay. Thanks, Scott. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see many old friends on the Zoom list. For those of you who don't know me, as Scott said, I'm Carrie Bentley. I'm CEO of Gridwell Consulting. This presentation is already up on gridwell.com if you want to download it, and we have some other information up there as well. As Scott said, Callie Wells and I run the CAISO committee. This call and this analysis really is for the CAISO committee, so it's a little bit loose. So you get to see what it's like on one of our committee member calls. WPTF, of course, is a non-profit trade forum dedicated to competitive markets and transparency across the West. So this presentation really is geared toward markets and competition and transparency. A little disclaimer. Things constantly change. This presentation is based on our views as of yesterday. The joint agencies provided an excellent assessment of the root causes from their perspective. It was a preliminary assessment though, so as more data comes in, their root causes may change and then our opinions may change. What we're doing here is we're just offering an additional perspective on this report. I would say this perspective comes from one more of an industry viewpoint, And then two, of course, because it's provided for the CAISO committee, the lens in which we view the report is really through markets and through competition. There are many important considerations to reliability, and I can't cover them all in an hour call. I could probably talk about them for 8 hours, but you guys would get really bored. So what this report or this analysis focuses on for the next hour is more near term, how to keep the lights on, a reaction to the report, and then some considerations, again, maybe a little bit more focused on the CAISO, but really does look over the whole reliability picture. So here's an outline of what I want to talk about. So first, just a reaction to exactly what the joint agency root causes were. So they put out a list of 3 things. And while, I hesitated at first to do this, I actually think it's very important to have an independent and transparent review of whatever agencies put out. This isn't to say that they didn't do a good job. I would say even if I ended up 100% agreeing with everything they said and had nothing to add, it would be important to have this reaction section simply to say, yes, as an independent assessment, I agree, or yes, and I would say, there's a different perspective on that I have compared to what was put out, but it's more of a yes, and not any sort of disagreement fundamentally on the issues for reliability. And the second piece of what I want to talk about, and I hope this will take up probably the bulk of our time, although there's a lot spent on the first section as well. And these are missing pieces. These are things that Gridwell believes are important for WPTF members to consider, particularly CAISO committee members in their engagement with the CAISO, that were just absent from the report. And again, it was a preliminary report and it couldn't cover everything, but there are 2 pretty fundamental missing pieces. The first one, just a little hint, is pricing. And I spend a lot of time on that. The other one is long-term planning, and Gridwell for the CAISO committee already put out an assessment, which again is on our website. That's a formal written paper, and we spent a lot of time on planning there. So I spend less time on it in the presentation, but I think these are 2 equally important missing pieces. And then finally, just a few quick takeaways and recommendations. The joint report did actually have some recommendations in it. And so likewise, I think it's important to react to those as well. Sorry, just a housekeeping issue. I've never shared my screen before. Frank, the top thing keeps flashing and it comes down. Does that mean I'm doing something wrong or no? Frank, Scott, any of you? All right. So no, you guys can hear me? Okay. If anyone can't hear me, please raise your hand to let me know.
We can hear you. You're doing fine.
You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, I don't know what that is. All right. And can you guys see this? Can you see my arrow?
Yes, we can see your arrow.
Oh, good to know. Okay, thank you. So, okay, topic 1, reactions. Okay, so Scott already mentioned this, but just as a reminder and refresher of the load shed events in California in August, the CAISO declared a stage 3 emergency for the first time in about 20 years on little after 6:30 on August 14th. And the reason they did this was not because there was insufficient energy, it was because reserves had fallen below minimum requirements. Reserves are set by NERC and WAC at 6% of load. And so to maintain compliance, that's why the CAISO initiated rotating outages. This may sound like a nuanced point to hit really early, but it actually has some pretty big pricing implications. So just keep in mind that the stage 3 emergency was called not because of insufficient energy, but because of insufficient reserves. These outages impacted, almost 500,000 customers and went on for a few hours. On the bottom here, you can see the timeline. The only thing I really want to note on the timeline is that even a few days before the stage 3 emergency, we knew the heat was coming. We knew high demand was coming in California. So the agencies took steps, maybe not enough steps, but they did take steps along the way to try and aid in the event. Sorry, dog. Okay, so here are the 3 primary root cause findings. And where I put things in quotes, that's a direct quote from the joint agency root cause analysis. So the number 1 reason was there was an extreme heat storm. And I'm going to take these individually going forward. The next one was that resource planning targets have not kept up with the net load peak. The net load peak is in the early evening hours, and planning targets are for the peak. And so the CAISO In particular, recently spent a lot of time talking about the need for net peak load planning. And then third, and I'm just going to say this directly because I thought the CAISO did a really succinct way in the recent presentation of explaining it, and it's that some practices in the day-ahead energy market exacerbated the supply challenges under highly stressed conditions. Okay, so first let's talk about the extreme heat storm. So for those of you that don't know what a heat storm is, that's not surprising. It's a recently made up term to describe these events. It was first used by an LA Times reporter, and then for whatever reason, it caught. And it's used in the analysis, and it's used in multiple places at this point. I'm sorry, hold on, my dog is driving me nuts. 1 second.
You can tell that we're all living in the Zoom environment because we actually do take breaks for animals.
I know, okay. All right, you see my sweatpants on too. Okay, so heat storm. So made up term, guys, but you know what it is? I don't think these regulators know what a heat storm is. If you're a sci-fi nerd, you'll know that a heat storm is a made up weather event on a fictional planet in Star Wars. So every time I hear heat storm, I start cracking up. I'm sure the people from Texas are like, this is extremely appropriate. You know, California is using a made up weather event about a made up planet to talk about their reliability. Anyway, so I try not to laugh too hard whenever I say heat storm.
It's so California.
It's so California, yeah. Okay, but let's actually translate heat storm into a technical term. So what this is showing is all the days in August, and the orange line is 2020. And what this is a 1 in 35 weather event. And so, you know, I was moving, I can confirm it was very hot on these days. So let's move now to how a heat storm translates into reliability. And the way a 1 in 35 weather event translates into reliability is through peak forecast demand and ultimately the RA requirement. So this slide is just a little refresher of the RA requirement and how it's calculated, and it compares it to demand. So you could see the blue line is August 14th actual demand in each hour. And what this is the peak 5 minute, peak 5 minutes in each hour. So it really is the most the CAISO had to meet in their real-time schedules. And then we're comparing that to first, the CEC adjusted 1 and 2 August peak load forecast, and that's that dotted line. And so if you recall, California, it has a monthly RA construct. So each month, the basis is the CEC's peak load 1 and 2 forecast. And so that's what it is for August. Then on top of that, you add about a planning reserve margin of 15%, and that gets you to the RA requirement. The RA requirement is the amount of supply that each load serving entity has to bring to the CAISO. So now how does that translate? So the RA requirement is made up of these two pieces, but weather only makes up a portion of the demand changes, right? So how does a 1 in 35 heat storm translate into a demand forecast? You could see here that the demand was clearly greater than 1 and 2, but does that mean that it's a 1 in 35? How do you translate that into demand? So the next few slides, I'm going to show you first how heat translates into demand in terms of forecasting. And then 2, talk a little bit about whether the forecast was off or maybe whether the planning reserve margin has to change. Because I would say heat played a role, but it's not the main driver of load shed events. And this is pretty intuitive. I think that you could think that, you know, a huge heat storm wouldn't impact demand that significantly. If you're in California, you turn on your AC if it's hotter than 80 degrees. And once it's 90, 95, that AC is running all day long. So whether it's 10 degrees hotter or not, your AC is going to run. So, you know, a 1 in 10 heat storm probably does about the same as a 1 in 35 heat storm. So I think this is one of those, yes, heat played a role and kind of moments reactions to the joint agency reports. So that said, something broke down within the RA requirement. So I think it's appropriate to say, okay, was it the peak load forecast or was it within the planning reserve margins? And how should we be thinking about what's going on in California? So here's first translating the demand into the different types of CEC forecasts. I don't have the capability to translate the exact demand into a 1 in X event. I think the CEC does, and I hope they do that. But what we can do is we could take the CEC's public forecast, they're a very transparent agency, and we could say, okay, what does it look like? Let's just compare the lines, right? That's an easy way to do it. No statistics needed. So you could see here that again, the CEC adjusted 1 and 2 peak load forecast, which is the basis for the RA requirement, is the black line. Now, for the data nerds out there, you know, a monthly 1 and 2 planning target is not the same as an annual planning 1 and 2 annual planning target, even if the peak day occurs in the same month. And that's because when you're planning 1 and 2 over a year, it's different than just, you know, 31 days in August. So you could see that the CEC adjusted 1 and 2, and there's adjustments, and it ends up to be a little bit below the CEC's annual 1 and 2. But, you know, they're only a few hundred megawatts off. And when you're talking about 45,000 megawatts, I don't think it matters that much, frankly. So now, and the reason why I say this is because the CEC does publish the 1 and 2, the 1 and 5, the 1 and 10, the 1 and 20. So we can compare this. So we could see demand on August 14th fell somewhere between the 1 and 2 and the 1 and 5. Maybe the August adjusted 1 and 5 would be a little different. So maybe it just barely hit it. So I think it's really interesting because when you start talking about planning, well, do you want to plan to the 1 and 5 routinely? Or if on an extreme heat storm day, we didn't even quite hit the 1 and 5, well, maybe then it would be inappropriate to use the 1 and 5 forecast as the basis every day. Because the planning reserve margin, that's this slide, has a percentage baked into it for load forecast error. I mean, you know, and RA requirements have all these different levers and they all impact each other. So yes, you could pull the load forecast lever, but we could also look at the planning reserve breakdown, planning reserve margin breakdown, and see if maybe that's a lever that would be more appropriate. Okay, so we're going from here, which is peak load forecast, now to planning reserve margin. Now this chart may look a little complicated, but it's actually a simplification of what's in the joint root cause analysis. So I think it's much more clear. And I will walk through it. There's even like a little bit of animation. Okay, so on the left-hand side, what you have here is the planning reserve margin target. So if you just look at the gray bar and the blue bar on, again, that left-hand side. Oh, I have a thing. Yeah, sorry. On the left-hand side, so I'm just talking about this now. The 9% plus 6% is that 15% planning reserve margin. Now about 6% of this is for contingency reserves, and you can see that, that's the gray. And then that blue bar, that 9% is for two things. It's for forced outages and it's for forecast error. I mean, let's ignore the white bar on top. Let's ignore this just for now. Okay, so then what actually happened? What were the reserves needed on the 14th? Well, we have that 6% NERC operating reserve standard, and that's spin and non-spin, but really you probably should account for regulation up as well, and that's about 1%. So really, if you're talking about what was actually needed on the day, you could translate that contingency reserve 6% and say, no, we really actually needed 7%. And the next piece, the 9%, on the day, that darker blue bottom bar, there was a forecast error, that CEC 1 and 2 peak load forecast error was about 5%. Okay, see that? And then on top of that, we have forced outages. And the forced outage rate was pretty low. It was only 4.8%. But you can see that between the two, you know, there's a 0.8% greater need than the 9% that was planned. Now, on top of that, we have these actual unreplaced planned outages. And that doesn't come from the planning, oh, can you see that? Hold on. That doesn't come from the planning reserve margin. What the planned outage comes from is from a planned outage process, and there aren't supposed to be unaccounted for planned outages within the planning reserve margin. That all should be accounted for upfront before the RA month. So the problem was the planned outage process broke down a little bit, and these outages weren't replaced. So the CAISO went into the RA month already being about 1.1% short. So now if you add up the additional contingency reserves needed, the additional forced outage and forced outage error, or forecast error, and the planned outages, you now go back to the planning reserve margin and you see the planning reserve margin would have needed to be about 2.9% higher to maintain reliability on the 14th. So hopefully that's pretty clear. This is just a very basic way to say this is what the planning reserve margin, should have been to maintain reliability. This is not doing any sort of statistical 1 in 10. This is just a buildup so you can understand the different levers you could push and pull. So
Carrie,
now,
Carrie, we've got a clarifying question. Does the August 14th demand in the chart reflect forced outages? If it does, the demand on that day reflected a 1 in 10 year forecast.
Does the demand reflect forced outages? Forced generation outages?
Yeah.
No, so demand just reflects demand from load.
Okay. So, but this is not, so in other words, if this doesn't meet the 1 in 10 year forecast.
Right, so you always have your peak load forecast and then you have your planning reserve margin on top of that. So one way how I think you're thinking of this is you're thinking, okay, if I had, where's my little thing? If I had a 1 in 2 and I add a planning reserve margin on that, that gets me way up here. So yes, if you didn't have a planning reserve margin and you needed all these extra things, you would end up somewhere up here. That's not the way we really think about it. We think about what is our load forecast, and then we have to account for forecast error and outages on top of that.
Another question that just came in that says, does 5% forecast error mean that demand was 5% above the CEC 1 and 2 forecast?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm glad I'm on this slide. So this is actually 4% error right here between the demand, the seen demand by the CAISO and the CEC 1 and 2 peak load forecast. But what happened is we had demand response programs employed. So this demand already reflects the demand response programs. So if you add back in the reserves and the demand needed for that, you actually end up with a 5% load forecast error. So that's why there's a little bit difference between demand and this, and then you have to add in all the DR stuff, and then that gets you to a 5% load forecast.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so now we have the planning reserve margin breakdown, and we kind of see how you could tweak the peak load. But I don't want people to think that those are the only tools, because of course we could look at the right-hand side and say, what could we have impacted within the right-hand bar that would perhaps impact the need for the planning reserve margin? So one very basic thing that the CAISO could do is to derate predictably unavailable thermal capacity upfront. And by that, I don't mean UCAP, I don't mean what the Eastern markets do, I mean what most ISOs do naturally, and that's to have, it's considered best practice, and that's to have a summer PMAX and a winter PMAX, or a summer rating and a winter rating. And that's because most thermal generators, unless they've taken the onus to account for that up front, have an ambient derate due to temperature. And so now if we break down this chart again, reserves are the same, right? Planned outages are the same. The 5% is the same. But now I've broken out the forced outages into all forced outages except ambient derates due to temperature. And so if the CAISO just had PMAX or limited the amount of RA from these thermal generators up front, you would have had 1.6% less forced outages because this wouldn't have counted as RA to begin with. This is a very easy way, I think, to more accurately count your resources. And again, this isn't a WPTF proposal. I'm just trying to note that there are ways to tweak forced outages and RA counting that are very simple, that then directly go back and impact your planning reserve margin. Because you could see in the prior slide, you had a 2.9% need. And now by simply doing that one tweak, you're now down to a 1.3%. You know, the next thing is if you improved your planned outage process. So now we go here and we take away those planned outages that started the month short, and we go down to a 0.2% planning reserve margin needed. So again, this isn't to say that the CAISO necessarily needs to do these things. is just to show that there are small tweaks to the RA program that could lead to relatively high reliability impacts. So, overall, reason for blackout, extreme heat storm. I think the narrow implication of that is that the CEC demand forecast was too low, but I think that's the wrong takeaway. I think the right takeaway is that the RA requirement's probably a little low. I think the next takeaway is that there's some low-hanging fruit that the CAISO and CEC could do, and CPUC, that would probably yield large increases in reliability. And then finally, I hesitate to get into this, but I think it's probably time for the 1 in 10 loss of load expectation study to be updated. The last one was done in 2010. I think it's pretty amazing that no one ever talks about this study because it was prescient. These people were clairvoyant. I'm not going to go through this, but if you go through this old study, they really did do a good job of saying, as we go through this renewable transformation, you're going to have to change your planning reserve margin. And we didn't. I mean, we had a study, CPUC and CAISO paid for the study, and then they didn't follow its advice. And I asked Brian Thaker why no one mentioned this really kind of clairvoyant study. And he said the whole proceeding was so painful, he wanted to erase it from his memory completely. So I'm guessing the results were not popular. But, I hope a lesson learned by the agencies could be that even if study results aren't popular, doesn't mean that they shouldn't drive policy. Okay. Oh, I'm learning. Okay, so whenever there's a chat, that's why the thing goes down for me. All right, so then the next thing that the CAISO talked about was net demand challenges. So this kind of looks like the duck curve a little bit, kind of not, so this should be somewhat familiar to most people. So what we have here is the blue line is the demand on August 14th and 15th, but let's just focus on the 14th. This is taken directly from the root cause analysis. And so you'll see that peak demand was 46,000 megawatts, close to 47,000 megawatts, a little before 5 p.m. And then the orange line shows the net demand. And the net demand is simply demand minus solar minus wind. And you see that's around, a little over 42,000 megawatts. So there's about a little over, a 4,500 megawatt difference between these two numbers. And so the CAISO makes the very strong point within their section of the paper that peak planning has been done around the peak, naturally, right? It's peak load planning. And that they haven't done as good of a job as planning around the net peak. And they note that the gray bars are when the stage 3 event happened. I struggle with this a little bit. I think this is also another yes and moment when I'm reacting to their conclusion. So yes, they're struggling around the net peak. And I actually thought, so in the CAISO's presentation, Delphine Ho was both very candid and clear, and I want to say what she said. She said, this is not to point at renewables being the problem. This is to point at planning. Planning targets have not kept pace. I think in the short term, maybe that's true. I think in the long term, maybe that's true. But in the short term, I don't think the root cause of these net load blackouts was because planning targets hadn't kept pace. I think that will be a problem going forward, but that's not, our analysis does not support that being as a problem today and does not support that as being a cause of the blackouts. There are issues with peak load planning. And if you fix this peak load planning, this will almost inherently solve your net load issue until not more solar comes online, but until you have 4-hour storage, and that becomes the main replacement. And I'm gonna walk through that because I think this is a really important point. It's hard because I completely agree with the conclusions of the report that says we need to think more about the net load, but I disagree that it was a root cause of the prior events. And here's why. Okay, so this chart is a little bit, again, complicated. I have these broken down in different ways in our initial preliminary report that's posted on our website. So if you're interested more about what resources were online during the event, you could see that there. This is really just trying to pull together the solar piece. All right. Okay, so what this chart is is you have the demand, and that's that black line at the top. And then you have net demand, which is the dotted line run underneath that. And again, that is demand minus wind minus solar. Okay, and so you see the peak again, it's 46,000 megawatts, and then the net peak's 42. So each of the bars stacked up are the contribution to demand in that hour. So you see at 3 p.m., the bottom bar is natural gas, and then you have nuclear, and then you have water, etc., all the way up to the top. And so the yellow bar is solar, and the 3,176 megawatts is the maximum contribution of solar to reliability. That is the amount on the August NQC RA list that should possibly count toward reliability. That is using the ELCC calculations and has been established, by the CPUC and agreed upon by the CAISO. The amount over that, the dark yellow.
Carrie, just a minute.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, because ELCC is not a universal term.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Electric load carrying capability. It's what each resource is sort of rated for reliability purposes, correct?
Correct. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So when you're doing planning, you would never plan, for example, on the peak of more than 3,000 megawatts of solar being able to contribute to reliability. It's effective load carrying capability, but whatever. So you could see this is the contribution that CAISO CPUC can count on for reliability, and then this is the rest of the solar, the market solar. It has probably a must offer obligation. It was still paid for as RA, but it's not what is counted toward peak load planning. It's just what is, dispatched by the market. So what you have here is over time and during the peak, solar during the peak, of course, far exceeds what it's being counted on from a reliability perspective. And then over time, yes, you get down to during the net load peak is only providing about half of its reliability capability. It's a reliable amount. But the load to the net load goes down by over 4,000 megawatts. So there's no way that the CAISO should be counting on that amount of solar to be there during the net load peak anyway. So it's not that solar is causing the problem. What it is that solar is actually masking the peak load problem, because solar is making up for missing needed capacity during peak load. So I want to emphasize that during the load shed events, it's not that solar caused the problem by not showing up during the net peak. It's that solar prevented there being a problem during the peak. So it's a very different take, I think, than maybe was implied by the report. Where I think we actually will run into issues in the future is if these market imports, which are the gray, or thermal capacity retires, and instead we end up with 4-hour duration solar. Tell me within here which 4 hours you want the solar. If you end up using, the storage, you end up with 4-hour duration storage that you use during the peak. It also won't be available during the net peak. So I think it would be a long time before solar caused an issue, but 4-hour duration storage could rapidly cause a problem during the net peak load. So again, I completely agree with the need to go forward and evaluate the net peak load, but I don't think that was the cause, and I don't think we need immediate RA targets. I think we just need better consideration of our resource mix within the IRP, within our procurement practices. Okay, so the third challenge, which I'll go through pretty quickly, it's an easy one, is day-ahead practices exacerbating supply challenges. So what this chart is showing is it's showing day-ahead bid-in demand not being as high as actual demand or the CAISO forecast of CAISO demand. So basically, load serving entities under scheduled in the day-ahead market. These numbers have already been updated since the report came out. Apparently, it didn't include losses. So maybe underscheduling load in the day ahead market wasn't as bad as initially thought, but there was still underscheduling. So just a quick reminder for those of you who are not immersed in the day ahead market. So I got a weird light on my face when I move over. So the day ahead market is made up of two processes. The first one is the integrated forward market. This is where virtual and physical bid-in demand is cleared against virtual and physical bid-in supply. It is a financial market. Then after this, the residual unit commitment or RUC process begins. And what this is adjusted physical supply cleared against adjusted CAISO forecast of CAISO demand. And what those adjustments aren't really that important. They just look at things like wind, for example, that never bids in the day ahead but shows up in real time. They adjust for that. The CAISO market operators can adjust the CAISO forecast of CAISO demand. There can be zonal adjustments and that sort of thing. But the purpose of RUC is that it's a reliability market, and it's supposed to ensure that physical demand meets physical supply. So if you have things like the underscheduling of load in the integrated forward market, RUC will come in and make sure that that's not an issue. So what happened? So load underscheduled, which caused a relatively higher amount of exports to be scheduled. And this is because supply didn't have to meet, the load. They could meet these export schedules instead. RUC, due to an implementation defect, when clearing that adjusted physical supply against the demand forecast, instead of ensuring there was enough physical supply to meet it, they relaxed the system power balance constraint. And so practically what that means is that rather than cutting exports in RUC and saying, sorry, we don't actually have enough supply to meet both forecasted load and these export schedules, instead they relaxed that requirement and didn't cut the exports. This was not how RUC is supposed to work because again, RUC is supposed to be the reliability market, but there was an implementation defect, and that defect had probably been there since 2013. I'm not sure, the CAISO didn't give an exact date, maybe they will, but I think that's when the RUC optimization was last touched. So it's been there a long time, but this defect only matters when supply can't meet demand, and that just doesn't happen very often. So I agree, this is the CAISO and joint agencies explanation of what went wrong, and I think they did a good job of owning up to it. So the narrow implication definitely from the report was that load was inappropriately underscheduling. Again, I think Delphine Ho during the CAISO presentation did a good job of taking out that inappropriate from the tone. Load was underscheduling, and they said it's important to find out why, and Gridwell supports that. But our analysis really shows not that load underscheduled, but market systems need periodic updating. I'm just going to be pretty candid about this. The CAISO has a shocking amount of defects for an ISO. I've worked with almost all the other ISOs, and the CAISO by far has the highest number of defects during an implementation, probably the highest technology debt. So the longest amount of time to fix all these defects. And let's give the CAISO credit. It's a very complex optimization. I think in Petter's retirement notice, he was the head of technology. It said it's the most advanced optimization system in the world. So I'll just say that if you have the most advanced optimization system in the world, you should probably also have one of the most sophisticated auditing processes. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so just now an overall reaction to everything. I think the joint agencies provided a strong foundation and gave very transparent data that will allow the agencies to do a final report and industry to continue their assessment. But just a few general observations. I think it focused on resource adequacy rather than longer term planning challenges in kind of an odd way. I expected definitely to see more on the integrated resource plan from the CPUC and how we led to planning to steel in the ground. There was also no indication that these issues are quick to resolve. It sounds like we're going to be in this situation until storage can come online and until who knows what? It seems very up in the air. It's particular up in the air given that we're about to retire a giant nuclear plant as well. So it seems like we're going to be in this very tight capacity situation for some time. And that means we're going to continue to have to, in California is going to have to continue to rely on imports and large amounts of storage and hybrid coming online. Just my quick reaction. All right. Scott, do you want to add anything before I move on to missing pieces?
No, I think you're doing a great job on this. It's flowing quite nicely. So keep driving.
Thanks. I'm going to avoid the light some more. Yeah. If you guys can believe it, our CAISO committee calls are a little bit even more insane than this. Okay, so some missing pieces, and this is my favorite section, I'm just gonna say. Okay, so if I start talking fast, remind me in, because you guys know I get a little passionate about prices. So the two notable missing pieces, energy market pricing, both for imports and energy imbalance market implications, and then resource planning. So first, a drink of water before I get into this, get excited. Okay. Accurate price formation is key to any functioning competitive market. And what I mean by price formation, I mean that prices should be responsive to supply conditions. So as supply tightens, you would expect that, that prices should increase because this would signal the need for additional supply. This is particularly important when California relies on market imports to keep the lights on. And by that, I mean imports that are not under an RA obligation or EIM transfers, which are not under an RA obligation. So they're solely delivering energy to California in response to market signals. And these market signals are entirely through the energy market prices. So external suppliers react to these signals and they have to make a decision. Do they want to sell to California or do they want to sell in the bilateral market? And I don't care if California really needs the energy more than the bilateral market. That's not a factor. They respond to prices. So if our prices don't reflect our actual supply conditions, California may not get the very much needed imports and EIM transfers it needs. Some people get a little confused when we talk about the EIM. So just to also note, CAISO market prices compete in a way with EIM BAA market prices because the additional transfers available on the system will flow to wherever the price is highest. And so if CAISO is higher market prices, and I'll go through some data on this, we'll get more EIM transfers. If we don't, we won't. So I want to talk really quickly. There's been some discussion, and there was this was both in the joint agency root cause analysis, and there was a really interesting article that I linked to at the end of this as to whether or not the CAISO BAA flex ramp up sufficiency test impacted supply coming into the CAISO. So within the EIM, there's these different tests that happened, and basically one of them, the CAISO failed, and the result of that was that there was an import transfer limit imposed on EIM transfers. So the CAISO in the root cause analysis, and Gridwell has verified that the 5-minute energy transfers were below this imposed limit. Thus, the failure of the flex ramp up sufficiency test did not impact EIM transfers. Overall, EIM transfers into the CAISO BAA were higher on August 14th than the prior week. But I want to talk about this EIM transfers being price responsive, what happened on the day because of that. So here, let's just look at prices overall generally to see what happened. So you could see that CAISO 5-minute prices really diverged from the day ahead and 15-minute prices. Let's just sit with this chart for a bit. This is the system marginal energy cost. And you can see the day ahead market prices in the blue. You can see that they're pretty high and they start to rise, you know, what, hour 16 or so, they started to get pretty high and they reach above $200 pretty quick. You'll see the 15-minute market mimics this. It has some early price spikes and then has some sustained high prices throughout the afternoon. But then you look at the real-time price. And you can see two very large gaps between the 15-minute price and the 5-minute price. And you can see this gap here See, prices don't actually rise until, you know, 6:30 almost, and then they fall back down very quickly. Now, if you put this and you overlay the stage 2 and stage 3 events, you'll see that throughout stage 2 and stage 3, you really have these high day ahead market and 15-minute prices, but you don't have high 5-minute prices. So what's the implication from that? Well, the implication on that is that if you don't have high 5-minute prices signaling the need for energy, your EIM transfers are going to go down. So what this chart is showing is that this average EIM transfers into the CAISO BAA from other EIM areas. I've just highlighted the critical hours, and you could see that the purple is the 15-minute market transfers, and the blue is the 5-minute market transfers. And you could see the 5-minute market decked down the EIM transfers while we were in the middle of stage 2 and stage 3 events. And in some cases, they decked them down by, you know, over 500 megawatts. You guys recall that planning reserve margin, that extra bit needed, that actually translates to only an additional 634 megawatts needed. So EIM maybe could have saved us if price formation was in place so that this real-time 5-minute price was actually reflective of true supply conditions. I think this is a very important takeaway. It just was not talked about. So now here's just a little bit, how are we on time actually? All right, I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly, but here's just our underlying analysis showing that EIM transfers are very responsive to CAISO prices. So this is just showing that whenever there's a premium of $10 between the CAISO BAA and other BAAs, that's when transfers start coming into the CAISO. So you could see this is the California BAAs in red and what their average 15-minute energy prices are compared to the other BAAs. And you could see that in the 15-minute market, there was much more than a $10 premium. And that's why we were getting all these transfers from the other BAAs in the 15-minute. Now, when we look at the 5-minute, you'll see that all the 5-minute prices were almost exactly the same. Except for maybe the Northwestern BAAs, but you can see with the Eastern BAAs, they were right aligned. And then across the day, almost everyone's 5-minute prices were exactly the same. So there wasn't that $10 premium. And so that's why we ended up back here. You didn't have the premium in the real-time market like you did in the 15-minute market. So it was decked down. And so in real time, when we actually needed the energy, it didn't show up.
Carrie, I've got a question that just came in. And the question is, reading it, weren't CAISO's transfers limited though because they failed the resource efficiency test?
They were not. Yeah, that's this first slide back here. They were not limited. We have, I think there's a slide in the appendix that shows this explicitly, but the CAISO verified that in their joint agency report. It's the very last page of the report. The import transfer limit was higher than the 15-minute or 5-minute transfers in. So it didn't actually limit anything.
Okay. So to put so what you're saying in the rest of this is prices do work, but for some reason prices weren't allowed to work.
So what I'm saying here is that prices work, but price formation is wrong. Something is off in the CAISO price formation where the 5-minute price wasn't high enough. So naturally we didn't get transfers because there wasn't a price to respond to. That we see the 15-minute price was high and it was higher than the other EIM BAAs. So transfers came in response to that 15 minutes, and then they went out again when the prices didn't remain high in the 5-minute market. That's a strong price formation issue when your 5-minute prices don't reflect scarcity.
Yeah.
Good, thanks for that clarification. That's a point I want to make really clear, is that 15-minute price formation seems to be working okay. The 5-minute is what is not responding to scarcity. We don't have time to get into all the technical details of why that's happening, but the overarching, I think, explanation is that if you recall, the reason for the stage 3 emergency was because the CAISO ran out of reserves. Reserves are only procured and priced, and that scarcity price for reserves is only in the 15-minute market. And there's no functional connection between ancillary service scarcity pricing in the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. The 15-minute schedules just roll into the 5-minute as self-schedules, and then only energy is co-optimized. So there's no way today for that 5-minute price to reflect ancillary service market scarcity, and it's the AS scarcity that was causing these load shed events. So that's why the 15-minute was high and the 5-minute was low. And that is a price formation issue and a significant one that should be changed.
So a question just came in that the question is to confirm EIM only reacts to 5-minute prices. Is that correct?
So EIM transfers react to both the 15 and the 5-minute, but your ultimate schedule is your 5-minute schedule because it's all incremental. So again, you could see that transfers were high in the 15-minute market, and then they were reduced down, unfortunately, to that blue line in the 5-minute market.
Okay.
Okay, so now I want to talk about 2 more pricing issues, and these are policy issues that weren't touched on at all, but relate to price formation. So there are 2 policies that are at the CAISO right now that will adversely impact price formation. The first one is FERC Order 831, and the CAISO's proposal to address this will only allow prices to rise to $2,000 per megawatt hour under limited conditions. This will mute a much needed price signal and will put California at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the bilateral markets across the West. So under this proposal, the market will intentionally relax that power balance constraint and keep prices at the last cleared economic offer unless the shortage is more than 233 megawatts. So that means in practice, the CAISO could be in the exact same conditions like it was during the load shed events. It could be in AS shortage conditions. And in fact, it could completely run out of energy by up to 233 megawatts. And still the market will be based on the last cleared economic offer and not a scarcity price. I truly believe this is the opposite direction that we need to go in, not just from a price formation standpoint, but fundamentally a reliability standpoint. This will be, I think, a terrible policy for California and a way that will make it very challenging to compete with other Western states for energy, and not just compete, but signal that energy is needed. So then the second policy is almost as bad, and it's the system market power mitigation. You know, I have to say Gridwell is, you know, the 2 owners of Gridwell are myself and Callie Wells. We both worked in the Department of Market Monitoring. We both firmly believe in market power mitigation when warranted. But there is no evidence whatsoever that suppliers are able to take advantage of system market power right now. That would mean that an individual supplier would be able to change their bids at the exact right time to exert market power over the entire system. That just is not feasible. I'm going to say, like, as someone who does scheduling and bidding strategy for people, I wouldn't even know how to do that. And I worked for the Department of Market Monitoring trying to catch scammers like that. Anyway, so you guys can tell I don't like this policy. So the system market power mitigation will suppress market prices during tight supply conditions by design. The proposed test by design will have a tendency to result in false positives. And what that means is that it will mitigate resources offers down to the CAISO, to a CAISO estimated marginal cost for those resources when uncompetitive conditions don't exist. Callie Wells went back and she looked at August 14th. And she looked at the critical hours, hour ending 13 to 21, and she said, okay, had system market power mitigation, had this been implemented already, when would the test have been triggered? And the test would have been triggered in about 50% of the 15-minute intervals. Just because the test is triggered doesn't mean mitigation will actually occur, but it is in these tight supply conditions, tight transmission constraint hours, that the trigger actually is more likely to lead to mitigation. This would have meant that prices would have been suppressed down even further. See, Callie's texting me. Yeah. Oh, this was based on a CAISO. She wants me to let people know that she was able to do this analysis because of findings and a presentation in the last MSC. So if you go to the Market Surveillance Committee, you can get a lot more information on when these tests would be triggered and this policy in general. So absent scarcity pricing reform, if you put system market power mitigation in place, you are really going to leave California in a position where it could end up mitigating its prices down in the exact time it wants to signal scarcity. This is a bad position to be in. You can, however, put market power mitigation, system market power mitigation in place if you also pair it with scarcity pricing reform. So if you ensure that as you have tighter and tighter supply conditions, your prices are rising, and then you layer system market power mitigation on top of that, it's fine, because even though bids are being mitigated, scarcity pricing can kick in and still send those needed price signals. So again, it's not that we're against system market power mitigation generally or as a rule, it's that it really just needs to be paired with scarcity pricing reform, or it'll be a very large disservice to California reliability. Okay, so the missing piece conclusion there is just energy markets matter, price formation matters. I really think that because of these different agencies, energy and RA is siloed a bit. Sometimes they tend to forget that energy markets play a key role in reliability. And I think this is where the industry can really help the agencies, because to us, energy markets are key in reliability. And providing that additional perspective, I don't think you end up with different conclusions necessarily. I think you just end up moving down a path that is more efficient for everyone. Okay, so then the next thing I'm going to go over just very, very briefly, because we are running out of time a little bit, and that's just reliability planning. So we have these different timelines. This is a lot to get into, so I'm just going to say, just very briefly, reliability planning is so complicated in California, and it's complicated because you have 3 different agencies in charge of it. And you could see that in the long term and in the midterm, and particularly where you're doing reliability planning, you have the CEC that does forecasting, you have CAISO that does the transmission planning, you have the CPUC that does integrated resource planning, you have lunch through cooling extensions proceeding that tries to bring everyone together. It's a lot. In the midterm, you have that same sort of mix. You have the CPUC determining, or other local regulatory authorities, you have them determining the contribution of a resource to capacity, and then you have the CAISO that layers on deliverability on top of that. And so then ultimately, although the CPUC has probably 90% of responsibility for determining the reliability calculations, it's the CAISO that has that final NQC list. And I won't go through this in detail, but I'm just going to say there was a foreseeable capacity shortage. We knew that it was coming, and this wasn't probably addressed enough in the root cause analysis. So foreseeable capacity shortage, a lot of natural gas retirements over the last 5 years, almost 10,000 megawatts have retired. Over half of these were once through cooling retirements, but the other half, a lot of them were economic retirements. And the thing is, resources won't retire if there's accurate price signals within the RA market that they're needed. And the reason why there aren't accurate price signals is because it's a convoluted mess. It's really hard to figure out, 1, how much RA is worth now, 2, how much it's going to be worth it, 3 years from now, and then 3, to make long-term financial decisions. You cannot expect resources to get financing or pricing without transparency around an RA supply-demand makeup. Yes, Scott.
Yes, I'm just sorry. I'm typing to everyone because there are a number of you're getting a lot of chat going on, and we'll get to it as soon as you've concluded. Because some of these are some of it is commentary, some of them are questions, but they're not exactly clarifying questions. So I'm putting them off until you've concluded.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of talk about this, but I want to get to that Q&A session pretty quick. So let's just go through this, and then, yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Scott. So I want to talk about not just reliability planning across the agencies, but again, because this is a CAISO committee call in a way, let's talk about the CAISO. So there is a vast dispersion of reliability responsibility across the CAISO. I don't have a CAISO org chart. What I'm presenting here is simply how we function and operate within the CAISO on behalf of WPTF or on behalf of our clients. So you could see that the primary functions for responsibility for resource adequacy fall across the VP of Transmission Planning and the VP of Operations. And there's some very key things here. So for example, the Director of Grid Assets, which is under transmission, does the summer loads and resources assessment, right? But the VP of Operations under him is the Director of Operations Engineering, which is where the resource adequacy program is. And so things that should connect, like, do we have enough capacity this summer, don't end up connecting to things like our RA program, because the RA program is mostly under operations and the planning is mostly under transmission planning. You end up with sometimes, for example, I have CC'd 4 different directors when trying to get something done. So a resource came online, it had an incorrect NQC, but I had to go through the Director of Grid Assets because it was an interconnection and a deliverability allocation, to go through the Director of Market Services because that's new resource implementation. I had to go through the Director of Operations Engineering because that's where the RA NQC list lives. And then ultimately I had to get legal involved. And you end up with a mess like this. This is how stakeholders end up engaging with the CAISO on RA issues. And while it probably makes sense from the CAISO's perspective to have RA broken up across all these different groups, when someone like me tries to engage with them, or even worse, someone like the CPUC tries to engage on RA issues, you end up with missing linkages and just a convoluted engagement process. Now, it's not to say that each of these individual processes aren't done really well. And in fact, the CAISO has improved most of these processes significantly since about 2013. In particular, new resource implementation, interconnection, all these processes individually have been enhanced. However, what has not been enhanced is to have something like a VP of RA, someone who is ultimately responsible for resource adequacy and reliability. Because what happens is you end up having a question or you end up having a failure, and sometimes it's because of these missing links. For example, I showed you guys the planned outages that were not replaced before the month. So we went in, right, 1.1% short. That was in the planning reserve margin, that orange bar, right? And that decision was made by the Director of Operations Engineering, right? Oops, right here, right? So this is where that decision was made. And from their perspective, they thought they probably didn't need to replace it. They didn't need to do a significant or get more capacity. It was fine. But had perhaps the Director of Operations Engineering been under here, Director of Grid Assets, they would have known from the summer loads and resources assessment there was the high chance of blackouts this summer, that the CAISO was heavily relying on market imports, and it was not a good idea to go into, August short of RA capability. And again, the processes are set up where there were tools the Director of Operations Engineering could have done to get more capacity, but they didn't do it. And I have to think they didn't do it because of this, because there is no linkage between the summer loads and assessment and RA. Even the terminology is different between these two reports. The terminology is different almost across all these departments, and that makes reliability planning really hard. I'm not going to go into the NQC list, but I'm going to say it's things like this that drive me crazy. It's important to think what the NQC list is and what it doesn't do, and it differs across policies. It differs for different people. And this all again has to do with transparency. The NQC list right now is being used in the integrated resource model planning. It's being used in once through cooling, retirement assessment. And they're using this list as a proxy for future reliability from all these resources. That is not what the CAISO intends this list to be used for. All it's supposed to be used for is what can be shown in an RA plan. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, the NQC list, for example, has 8,000 megawatts of hydro. There is no way we should count on 8,000 megawatts of hydro showing up at peak year after year after year. That is a poor planning assumption, but it is the best planning assumption we have because all the CAISO puts out is the NQC list. And again, this is not to say that they don't do a good job or that it's an inappropriate list to put out. It's just, it's not the right list to use in planning. And unless the CAISO really changes and the CPUC change the way they engage with each other, the NQC list is just one example of how information will be miscommunicated, not just between agencies, but between departments at the CAISO. Okay. All right, Scott, do you want me to pause there for any clarifying questions, or should I just, this is a really fast section, or do you want me to just finish it up?
Let's drive through this because we have a number of questions, but and I'd like to get to them. Sure.
Okay, so there were root cause initial recommendations that I'm not going to go through. You could read through them. And then there was also CAISO market design enhancements recommendations that the report said that they were going to do. And I'm just going to say my general impression of these is maybe some of these are fine to do, great, do them, but they missed the forest for the trees. So I'm going to go and say what I think the short-term goal should be. And these are more high level, and I think, you know, we should use this as an opportunity to big picture it. Okay, so just 5 things. You need to incent market imports and EIM imports during the critical periods. This is the goal, right? This isn't the solution, this is the goal, to keep the lights on. These are the things we need to do. We need to incent existing generators with deliverability headroom to make capacity improvements. So over time, you get your interconnection and deliverability amount, and sometimes Pmaxes decrease over time. And then you can make capacity improvements to put it back up. That deliverability exists, the technology exists, but you're only going to do that if the financial incentive is there. So I think these agencies need to provide this financial incentive. You should, again, financial incentive to have resources outside the CAISO BAA, set up dynamic transfers, provide RA. I think they should embrace marginal RA improvements over radical redesigns. Maybe a radical redesign is needed, but I would like my lights to stay on next summer. And I think there are small, marginal, low-hanging fruit improvements that can be made to the RA program that will significantly impact reliability in the short term. And those should be prioritized before doing these radical enhancements. And both agencies do have the tendency to go for the big redesign first, but I think there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, and we should grab that and take advantage of it. And then finally, I think agencies should provide storage and hybrid easy onboarding. It's a new technology, it's a complicated technology to bid into the systems. And if you want them to be able to respond and bid in during critical periods, you need to enable and engage them early in the onboarding process. So how do we do that? I have 4 very simple recommendations. The first one is to embrace transparency, and I mean radical transparency. The CAISO and CPUC are the only agencies in the entire country that don't make public the system RA requirement. Every other ISO and RTO in the entire country makes that a public number, and I don't know why they don't, but they should. There should be radical transparency about the supply and demand balance by month, by year going forward. There cannot be price discovery or financing or any incentives for generators to offer additional capacity or do dynamic transfers or do all the things we need without price discovery and transparency. I'm not saying RA prices, bilateral RA prices should be made public. I'm saying supply and demand conditions need to be clear, understandable, and publicly understood so people can make decisions off of them. Number 2, I think everyone needs to take a do no harm approach to price formation. So that means not implementing those 2 initiatives as I described them earlier, and to fast track scarcity initiatives. The 5-minute pricing is an issue, and that should be fixed immediately. And then 3, the CAISO has an RA enhancements initiative. You know, the issues on this were probably appropriate 3 years ago. I think the issues are stale now. And it sounds like the root cause analysis plans on just going forward as planned, and I think that's really inappropriate. I think you should not have a policy that has stale issues, and that they should restart this initiative with a focus on short, mid, and long-term reliability, and really focus on putting forth needed marginal RA improvements as fast as possible. And then finally, I think the CAISO should provide a sandbox environment for future storage and hybrid scheduling coordinators, so they could start practicing now how to bid and engage with the CAISO optimization. This will have a 2-fold effect. I think one, these resources will be better prepared next summer to be able to provide reliability. They have a sandbox to practice in. And then two, I think it will incent generators to come online quicker because they'll see the profits they can make in this environment, in this market, and they won't want to miss out on them. The best way I know to ensure, storage resources come online is to give them a financial incentive to do so. And I think having a sandbox environment that allows them to see the profits they can make and how to operate within the CAISO market would go a long way toward doing that. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you everyone very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Carrie. That was fantastic. I think that was excellent analysis, and I like the emphasis that you were placing on the sort of low-hanging fruit that can be done by the CAISO. Let's jump into, we have a number of questions that have come up in the chat environment. I'm quickly going through the participants list of the raised hand function. I don't see anybody raising the hand. Just remember, if you do want to go on camera and ask a question directly, hit the raise your hand function in the participants box. I'm going back to the Zoom function. And let me go back to several questions that were put off earlier. One was, Carrie, just wondering if you've seen any data that has been prepared on what the rolling blackouts cost in terms of higher energy prices, lost productivity, et cetera. And most importantly, whether anybody was harmed by the blackouts. I haven't seen anything about that, have you?
No, I haven't. And they weren't on, the blackouts weren't long enough to impact critical infrastructure. So that's the one good thing, is that I would say this was a warning rolling blackout and not a severe event, like back in 2001.
Okay, one question that just came up, and I'm repeating this verbatim. The second price regime could look more like a dollars per kilowatt month using the CAISO's capacity procurement. This would serve as a cross-check on local RA policies. Wait a minute. Wait. Let me. He had a question before, a comment before then. While the failure of the flex ramp sufficiency test doesn't appear to exacerbate the problem, perhaps a redesign is in order to prevent cutting off an entity from a regional market at precisely the moment it needs it most. Rather than using a hard limit, a soft limit could be implemented with a new pricing regime above the soft target.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, actually. And I think, so if you have an EIM policy in general that in real time, sorry, my dog, that in real time cuts off people when they need it, that's actually very similar to, my scarcity pricing point. You want to incent people to come in when they need. So I think that's a great idea. And more importantly, I think as you extend EIM to the day ahead market, that will be incredibly important, because you don't want to cut people off at the day ahead market if they fail the sufficiency test. So yeah, I think it's a great idea.
One question that came in quite a while ago, it said something else to think about is that the 5-minute transfers to the CAISO are limited from the Northwest based on dynamic transfer capability on the COI.
Say that again. What? I missed the question.
Well, it's an assertion. Something else to think about is that 5-minute transfers to the CAISO are limited from the Northwest based on dynamic transfer capability.
Oh, on COI. Yeah, yes, I agree with that. And one thing I didn't touch on here is that there were transmission constraints both inside and outside the CAISO that did prevent additional energy from coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. On the RA enhancement reevaluation suggestion for next steps, do you have any low-hanging fruit suggestions that could be a nearer-term focus of a rescoped RA initiative?
Yeah, I do. You can actually read WPTF's comments, and we touch on a lot of them there. But I think prioritizing the planned outage process and having a backstop market or something akin to a CPM for planned outages should be on there. I think just a quick look at, as I said, thermal ambient derates due to temperature should be on there. And then I think coordination between CAISO backstopping and CPUC backstopping will be really key. I also think radical transparency by design should be number one on the RA enhancements low-hanging fruit list.
So a question that came in, somebody named Gary Ackerman.
Never heard of him.
I never heard of him, but anyway, he says, does Kerry believe that having a COO, such as what Mark has recently been elevated to, at the CAISO will help erase some of the multiple boxes needed to address the RA issues?
Well, generally, I think Mark does a good job of everything he does. So my hope is that Mark would, as the CEO, notice that gap and fill it. I think having a CEO in general will streamline a lot of processes, and it's a great role for him. But yeah, I still think you need a VP of RA because Mark's too busy to care exclusively about resource adequacy, and you want someone who owns that process. So I don't think having a COO is enough, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
This is more of an assertion by someone, and perhaps you want to comment on it. This person said, I would add that various BAAs and flexibility make it impossible for us generators to dynamically schedule our generation into CAISO. We're currently trying to set up a dynamic schedule for our assets, but because of the three BAAs we cross are not aligned in their dynamic schedulability rules.
Yeah, no, I will comment on that. And as a consultant, I've been trying to help several generators pseudo tie or dynamically schedule into the CAISO, and it is a challenging process, and they're making it harder. And it's because of some inability to measure whether something's coming from EIM or from a generator that's dynamically scheduling in an EIM BAA. And so there's technology and policy fixes that are really needed. So while I think it's low-hanging fruit to have additional dynamic transfers, it's not low-hanging fruit that can be captured right now by market participants. It's low-hanging fruit for the CAISO to fix.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And of course, this sort of ties into what the CPUC recently did on its RA import rule, which is, in the view of WPTF, has made it less attractive to for there to be RA or imports designated for RA into California.
Yeah.
I'm just going through the comments.
I think I saw Travis raise his hand too at some point.
Oh, Travis. Oh, there we go. Hey, okay. Let's take Travis off mute. And Travis, you got a question?
Yeah. Hi, Kerry. This was really great. I decided to mix things up by appearing on the camera.
I like it.
I wondered if you had any thoughts. You focused a lot on CAISO, but one of the interesting things about the resource adequacy market in California is that fundamentally the purchase obligations are imposed on, individual LSEs to kind of figure it out however they will, as opposed to, a centralized forward auction. And that ends up meaning, I think, that it's really important to ask whether, first you want to impose incentives on those LSEs to come into real-time covered, and you can only do that through right price formation, I agree. But if we're just assuming that price formation is going to be kind of crappy, then RA becomes all the more important, and making sure RA is both aligned to reality, again, one of your points, but also that the buyers of RA have sufficient incentives to both buy enough of it, care about the product definition seems to be really important. And it just seems like a lot of the LSEs in California have largely been immunized from those incentives, or the penalty structure for not buying enough RA is also probably wrong in terms of penalty versus what RA actually goes for. I wonder if you could give your thoughts on what might have to be improved on the kind of buy side of RA through PUC regulation in order to make the construct that you're talking about on CAISO work as well.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the challenges with the bilateral RA market. When you impose penalties, a penalty comes with a price. And that price is only as good as it relates to the market price for RA. And what has happened is the price for RA, because of tight supply conditions, have skyrocketed. And you're right, those penalty prices have not kept pace. And that will be true in almost any regulatory environment where you have this opaque bilateral construct. So yeah, honestly, I think the best thing the CPUC could do right now is to really focus on getting a solid RA requirement, reform those QC requirements a little bit more, and then yeah, keep pace every single year with the changes in RA prices with the penalties, and then to impose them across all the products, across system, across local, across flex. But here's the key: if the CPUC does this in isolation, you could end up having an overly punitive process when you couple it with the CAISO CPM. So we want to have it fair and we want to be coordinated. So I don't think the CPUC should do anything in isolation. And I actually think there needs to be better coordination between the CPM backstop process and the CPUC's penalty processes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Travis, for bringing that up. Although I will say that there are from somebody who is a veteran of centralized capacity auction at PJM, there are many benefits to a bilateral RA process. That the centralized one can really cause some problems. But that was just an editorial comment.
Can I editorialize on that too? I completely agree. I don't think we need to get rid of our bilateral construct. I just think if you have a bilateral market, you need to embrace transparency.
Exactly. You have to embrace transparency. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that. So a question to you, and this has come up with regard to what actually happened on the date. Carrie, how much do you think the full loading of Path 15 and 26 affected the ability for Pacific Northwest imports to serve SP15 demand? Is loading of intra-CAISO transmission a consideration in recent blackouts?
You know, I think it is, and I think that's one of the things that needs to be evaluated more in the final root cause analysis. I didn't have enough data on that to even comment on it, but I think that's absolutely an area of interest that both, you know, us as responders, industry responders, and the joint agencies should look into.
Okay, and question, this obviously somebody's dealing with exports and imports. Given the current price formation issues, might a new nomogram be the most effective, very near-term solution to prevent power from leaving California during scarcity?
So a nomogram is just constraints against multiple individual constraints from a mathematical perspective. So I'm assuming you're saying somehow limit exports. Usually you would apply a nomogram directly in the energy markets. I would argue that ROC fulfills a similar function, and that, you know, ROC will set up the resources such that you essentially have constraints on exports, and then the real-time market should do the same thing. So I'm not sure, you know, exactly what they're going for there, but I would generally prefer a market solution to a, you know, constraint solution.
Yeah, no, a nomogram is the typical way of they've done things in the Western Interconnect. But yeah, the reason for having a market is it gives instantaneous signals. Going through, hey, Travis, you need to take your hand down, unless you have another question.
Don't.
On RA enhancement reevaluation for next steps, do you have low-hanging fruit suggestions that could be?
I got that one already.
Okay, we got that one. Sorry about that. Oh, the last intertie 15-minute market liquidity workshop was 5 years ago this month. Maybe it's time for another one.
Yeah, yep. Good comment.
Yeah, good comment. Yeah, there definitely needs to be some updating of that. And although Brian Thaker did say that you quoted him quite well in terms of how difficult the 2010 study was, but that nobody wanted to embrace the results.
Scott, just let you know, 3 minutes. Do you want to do a recap at all? Just want to make sure you have time to say your piece if you have anything.
Yeah, well, we're going, actually, one of the reasons we do probably need to go beyond, not go beyond the time is Crepsey has got its own RA discussion that's about to go on. So let's go ahead and recap it. I think the analysis that you provided was absolutely spot on, and it should be, I would hope it would be taken as very helpful by the CAISO, because I think the CAISO does deserve a lot of kudos for being as fair as owning some of the issues that they did, and so hopefully this will be viewed as useful information. I think one of the things that you mentioned, but I like to emphasize, there's got to be some coming together between the CPUC and CAISO in terms of the methodologies and the accounting that they use. But the other thing is, why don't a regional approach to RA and market integration would have taken care of a lot of these things if you had if you had market integration. And I really would love for market integration to happen sooner. But I think that a lot of the things that you've shown was that having better methodologies and adhering to that, and as you said, radical transparency is the key going forward. And I really appreciate your bringing that up. That's what we've got so far. Thanks again to Carrie for this excellent analysis and what Treadwell does on behalf of the CAISO committee for WPTF. And we'll be having, as issues come up, you can, and if you didn't get a question that you wanted answered, you can go directly to Carrie if you're a member of the CAISO committee. If you're not a member of the CAISO committee, you may want to think of becoming members of the CAISO committee. And if we've got people on here who aren't members of WPTF at all, you may want to become a member of WPTF. But that's what we've got. Thank you all for attending. And we had, at my count, 215 people participating. So it was excellent discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending.